Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Abraham Lincoln, and the focus is frontier youth for honest old age. The Lincolns first settled in North America in the 1630s as part of the Puritan migration. It was Samuel Lincoln who came over and settled in Salem, Massachusetts, but the Lincolns moved around a bit. Some went to New Jersey, some went to Pennsylvania, and some went out west to Kentucky. This is where tragedy struck, where Lincoln's grandfather was killed in an isolated Indian attack, and his own father, 6-year-old Thomas Lincoln, was almost kidnapped as part of that process. He was being carried away when his brother Mordecai pointed a shotgun from a distance and shot and killed the Indian who was carrying Thomas Lincoln off, and his life was spared. Thomas Lincoln grew up in poverty on the frontier, mostly working the farm. He also learned skills as a carpenter, did some odd jobs. He married Nancy Hanks, 1806, and they settled in Elizabethtown in Kentucky in a simple log cabin on the Big South River where they had their first couple of kids, first a daughter and then a son. On February 12, 1809, they named the boy Abraham after his grandfather. The Lincolns were often on the move, almost always impoverished. Their next stop was Knob Creek Valley, where they settled on a farm, raised some corn and beans, and Lincoln had his first opportunity to go to school. Not very often, a couple days here, a couple days there in the one-room schoolhouse of Zachariah Riney, but Lincoln added it up later. The sum total of his education, about 1 year total, a few days at a time throughout his youth. Now, he and his father were very much of a different mind on this whole topic of education. Thomas Lincoln didn't see the point. He saw the job on the frontier was to go work the land, take care of your family. What do you need an education for that? Lincoln was the opposite. He was motivated, wanted to make something better of himself, and was interested in self-learning if he could, but he and his father never saw eye to eye on this or on many things. They didn't get along well, but Lincoln's mother, different story. She was nurturing, encouraging Lincoln to pursue some of these areas, but Lincoln lost her when he was only 10 years old. She died suddenly of a disease, and Lincoln later said, long after her sensitive heart and weary hands had crumbled into dust and had climbed to life again in forest flowers, all that I am or ever hope to be I owe to my sainted mother. But she was now gone. The Lincolns were living in Pigeon Creek. This was Spencer County, Indiana at the time, and frankly, pretty isolated, no kids around. And Thomas Lincoln also wasn't about to just sort of live on his own. He wanted another bride, and so for that, he left the family for a few months where he went back to Kentucky and he reacquainted with Sarah Johnston. She was a widow. They agreed to get married in December of 1819, and Sarah brought her 3 children, and they all came back to Indiana, where Abraham actually was glad to have them, and they were nurturing and supportive of him. He was welcoming of them. It was a positive experience as Lincoln continued to self-educate. This is one of the things he was certainly known for in his youth. His stepmother Sarah said that Abe read diligently. He read every book he could lay his hands on. And when he came across a passage that struck him, he would write it down on boards if he had no paper and keep it there until he did get paper. Then he would rewrite it, look at it, repeat it, all supporting sort of Lincoln's self-education, except his father. Again, they never saw eye to eye on this. So what was Lincoln noted for? He was noted for his reading and self-education. He was also noted for his strength, which was important on the frontier. Some of his first jobs around the age of 13, where his father was hiring him out, and one of the ones he did the best for a long time was as a rail splitter. He would split those rails all day, every day, up to 400 rails a day. Now, these were 10 feet long by about 4 inches wide. A day of that, and he would get 25 cents. Well, his first big job came when he was 18 years old, and Lincoln was noticed by James Gantry, who needed someone to help his son, Allen, take some cargo down the Mississippi River to New Orleans to sell. This was about a 1,200-mile journey, but Lincoln had shown himself in the area to be a good driver of a flatboat, and Lincoln got the opportunity to take this trip. It was mostly a successful trip, but also impactful on Lincoln. He went to New Orleans, big city, for the very first time, very different view of the world, including the first slave auction that Lincoln ever saw. It had a big impact on him. He said to his companions, "Boys, let's get away from this. If I ever get a chance to hit that thing," meaning slavery, "I'll hit it hard," and eventually, certainly he would. Lost the second woman early in his life around this time. His stepsister, Sarah, died. She was in childbirth at the time. She passed. Again, Lincoln hit very hard by this loss. Getting to the point where it's time for Lincoln to move on. He had longed to sort of get away from his father, get out on his own. He helped the family move into a new home on the north bank of the Sangamon River in Illinois, helped build that home, and then he left on his own. This was 1831. Lincoln's 22 years old. Basically, what did he have? Clothes on his back. That was it. Ended up in New Salem, Illinois, about 20 miles west of Springfield. Now, Lincoln got to work in New Salem in a local store. Danton Offutt owned it, and one of the benefits was that he had a place to live. He could sleep in the storeroom in the back. Lincoln tried not to be idle, though, again, moving forward on that self-learning journey that he was always on, and he heard that a neighbor 7 miles away, but a neighbor had a copy of Kirkham's Grammar. Well, this was gold to Lincoln, so he walked out there one day and asked to borrow it. It became kind of his constant companion as part of his self-learning. So, known for his self-learning, strength, and humor, Lincoln always had an anecdote, a story to tell, which helped make him very popular. He was popular, but he also got into a challenge once with the town wrestling champion, Jack Armstrong, who was noted for not only being strong, but kind of a leader of a bit of a gang in the town, and it was encouraged, here's a match. Lincoln's so strong as well, let's see what would happen. Well, Lincoln demurred on it, didn't really want to, but he was encouraged. He said, okay, fine, I'll wrestle with Jack Armstrong. Things were going fine there for a while when all of a sudden Armstrong kind of took a little foul play, and this got Lincoln aroused, where he grabbed Armstrong by the neck and held him at arm's length and shook him until victory was claimed by Lincoln in this. Now, Armstrong's friends weren't very happy about this. They were ready to pounce on Lincoln, but Armstrong, to his credit, he actually welcomed Lincoln into his inner circle. He was respected by this activity and said, "Boys, Abe Lincoln is the best fellow that ever broke into this settlement. He shall be one of us." And he was often had this effect on people who gravitated to Lincoln, and even ones who were having a little tussle with him. They welcomed him, and he would be friends with the Armstrongs for many years. Now, Lincoln was also ready to do his duty. The locals were on call because there was a breakout of war in the area with the Sauk Indians. A leader named Black Hawk was not happy with a recent treaty with the United States that forced the Sauks to go from their regular homeland on the east of the Mississippi River to west. Black Hawk didn't like it. He brought 1,000 of his followers back to the eastern side of the river to their more native land, started growing farm again, and the United States wasn't going to tolerate this. They had a treaty. They were ready to enforce it. Violence ensued, and now there's a war going on the plains. Army regulars from the United States showed up, but they also needed militia, and Lincoln was one of those who volunteered. He had no experience in the military, but he was popular with his friends, and he was actually elected the captain of their militia unit. Very proud of this. Lincoln said many years later that, talking about himself, by the way, in the third person, he said he has not since had any success in life which gave him more satisfaction on this being elected to captain. Again, Lincoln referring to himself there. Well, there were very few battles actually in the Black Hawk War, and Lincoln wasn't involved in any of them, but there was one gruesome sight that he and his colleagues stumbled upon. This handful of Americans had been scalped by Indians, and this got their ire up, and there was sort of this sense of revenge on their minds. But then an Indian came into the camp where he actually had some papers and said he was a friendly, he was not an enemy. But some of Lincoln's colleagues were still again out for revenge against that scalped Indian attack. But Lincoln said, no, this Indian is our friend, and he put himself in between the Indian and his colleagues. And he said that, I'll tell you what, I'll fight you all, one after the other, just as you come. Take it out of me if you can, but you shan't touch this engine. When a man comes to me for help, he's going to get it if I have to lock all Sangamon County. His friends stood down. Lincoln always had a sense of right and wrong. There was a moral quality to almost everything he did, all part of his growing up on the frontier. Now, Lincoln's and his friends' 3-month enlistments ended, but Lincoln actually stuck around a little bit longer as the war continued. He volunteered as a private. Didn't last all that much longer, and eventually his military career came to an end without getting into any battles. He later said, with typical humor, that while others were there fighting Indians, it was more than I did. But I had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes, and although I never fainted from the loss of blood, I can truly say I was often very hungry. Typical Lincoln, always having a story with some humor associated with it. Well, Lincoln got back to town and the Offutt store had failed, and so he picked up some odd jobs, eventually became part owner of a store, but this was a disaster. It went out of business, and Lincoln had now had a bunch of debt for the first time in his life. In fact, he called it his personal national debt. Well, many at the time, if they had debts like this, they would just leave, start over, and let the debt go away, but not Abe Lincoln. Honest old Abe, as he was starting to get this nickname, he vowed to pay off that debt. It took him about 17 years to pay it off, but he did. And again, this was part of getting that nickname. Other odd jobs, he became the postmaster in town. Lincoln famous for carrying around letters in his hat so he could actually go out and deliver them, have conversations with folks. He was very social in that regard. And he also loved the fact that all the newspapers that came into town went through his hands. Lincoln devoured newspapers. He loved it as part of his learning, and so he got a peek before he would have to deliver them. Lincoln also taught himself to be a surveyor as another chance to sort of make a little buck here and there, part of his odd jobs. This was all part of what Lincoln would call a really unremarkable youth. He would later say that it's a great piece of folly to attempt to make anything out of my early life. But, while this is sort of an honest reflection from his standpoint, not all that true, because you think about it. His youth clearly molded him. His self-learning was a profitable element to his entire well-being. Of course, his strength and humor, part of his likability and personal qualities, and that moral sense of right and wrong, all part of the molding of Abraham Lincoln as he was now set to launch into the next phase of his life and career in the law and politics, but that is the story for another day. That is Abraham Lincoln and Frontier Youth for Honest Old Abe from the life of Abraham Lincoln. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.